Hello, and welcome to POMA Does, a podcast produced by the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association. We provide a voice for osteopathic medicine and share insights on issues important to osteopathic physicians, residents, and students, as well as those who embrace the osteopathic philosophy. POMA's mission is to promote the distinctive philosophy and practice of osteopathic medicine for our patients, our members, and the communities we serve. Thanks for tuning in.
Welcome back to part 2 of our 2-part series on addiction and recovery in the medical field. If you missed our conversation with Dr. Richard Morgan, I encourage you to check it out in the previous episode. Today, I'm joined by Richelle Lehman, a pharmacist in recovery, who will share her personal journey and how she overcame challenges in her field. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Zona, a PCOM grad, 2006, and I practice addiction medicine and anesthesiology. Let's welcome Richelle Lehman. Hello, Richelle.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. I heard your story recently at Duquesne University, and I love that you go and talk to the students and make sure that they understand in the same way that Dr. Morgan speaks to medical students. You've been speaking to pharmacy students and other people in the community. Would you mind sharing with our listeners sort of the background of how you got into pharmacy and what transpired in your history of addiction?
Addiction's tricky because everybody wants to know exactly when or how or why. And it's not one of those things, that there really is an answer to. My parents raised us right. I grew up in a small town. My dad taught at the high school that I graduated from. My parents went to the high school that I graduated from, and my parents are high school sweethearts. They're still together today, and I have 2 wonderfully, boringly normal younger brothers. They raised us right. My dad was a school teacher and a farmer, and my mom was a nurse. We had good ethics and values and morals. There's just something different about me, and there always has been. As long back as I can remember, my first addiction was reading. I remember the first book I read, much like I can tell you about the first drink I had. Once I discovered how to read, I was always in a book. I always had a book with me. I often had an emergency book in case I finished the book I was reading. And I was always much happier with the lives in the book. I would be sad when the book was over, not necessarily because it was a sad book, but because I had to come out of that world and back into mine. And there wasn't anything wrong in my world. There wasn't anything I was trying to escape. I just didn't like the way it felt to be me. And it was a way to get out of me. Over time, that changed. It morphed. I'm still an avid reader, and I still will escape into a book at any chance I get. I still have that escape. But, as I grew, I was always looking for something else to help me feel better about being me. Had my first drink the summer I turned 15. There was a boy. Usually when I'm telling a story, it starts out with there was a boy, because I'm always looking for something on the outside to fix me on the inside. We were at the beach. His mother was the roommate of my mother's from nursing school. I've known the family forever. And, we're at the beach, and that night I have sex for the first time. I have my first drink, and I have my first cigarette. That's how I roll. Go big or go home. And, that was it. I wasn't one of these alcoholics or addicts, and I use the terms interchangeably, that was off to the races. I didn't have another drink for another year. And, in high school, we drank. That's what we did. We ran with a group that was a little on the rough side. They were athletes, but they were rough. We went to a lot of places that as an adult, I wouldn't want my children going to. But we were good girls. There was a group of us that were good girls. So nobody really said anything. We were at the top of our class. We were involved in the activities, student union, various sports, all of those things. So it wasn't like there was this big flag that we were headed down a wrong path. I graduated. I went away to college. I went to WVU at first. And again, there was a boy. He was a senior in high school, and I spent every weekend coming home. I could never be happy where I was at. I was always looking for something on the outside. I transferred to the University of Pittsburgh, got into pharmacy school, and, had a great time in college. My addiction and my alcoholism had not quite progressed. There were times I drank alcoholically. There were nights I stayed in and watched television too. I wasn't the girl in the sorority that was passed out all over the place, but I wasn't the one that was the designated driver. The summer before my last year in pharmacy school, I got the opportunity to go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina and work as a pharmacy intern. I went and I had a wonderful summer. I met my future husband. on the beach one day. He was a lifeguard. I was at the beach, and we're still happily married to this day. That kind of shaped the direction that my career took. I committed to a job in North Carolina, moved the day after graduation, went down there to be with him and to work and do all that stuff. And kind of a precipitating event for me, he worked for Ocean Rescue at the time. So, we're playing house and living this great life. And the end of the summer comes and he has to get a real job. His real job at that time was working as a paramedic firefighter, and they work 24-hour shifts. They do 24-hour on, 48 off. Now, my dad's a farmer. My mom's a nurse. So I'm used to unusual shifts. I'd been in healthcare since I was 17 years old. I worked for my mother, and she would schedule me on the holidays because she knew I wasn't going to call off. The cows had to be fed and so forth on Christmas. I'm used to these weird shifts and these weird hours. I'm not used to my people not coming home at night. So I'm 500 miles away from home, and I'm alone, and I'm afraid, and I'm bored, and I'm scared, and I don't like that feeling. So it starts out with really just a drink of wine in the evening. Then it's 2 drinks of wine, and then you're getting the bigger bottle because those little bottles are really only 2.5 glasses if you pour them right. And, then you're getting the bigger bottle, and the bigger bottle's kind of unwieldy. So you move on to the box. And one night you find yourself sitting in the kitchen on the floor, cutting the liner out of the box because you forgot to buy that extra box of wine. And how did this happen? It's really just a glass of wine. And you're sitting there and you're sucking on the liner and you're thinking, all I wanted was a drink. Meanwhile, life is happening. We got engaged. We bought a house. We got married. We got a dog. We were keeping the dog alive. Great. And so, the next thing you do is you have a baby. Well, when you're going to get pregnant, you decide you're not going to drink. And by that point, alcohol had become my everything. It was my happy and my sad, my celebrate, my mourn, my lonely, my bored, my I'm going to go do something. I'm going to stay home. Alcohol was my everything. So I took away my coping skill, and I had no coping skills. My pregnancy was very difficult. I went out on a leave at the beginning of my 3rd trimester. It was more mental health than pregnancy. I couldn't handle life. I ended up staying out on leave, and we dealt with severe postpartum depression. We moved back to Western Pennsylvania. I took this boy off the beach, brought him to sunny Western Pennsylvania, and, got some help here. Growing up in Pittsburgh, we really don't realize how lucky and how blessed we are to have the medical facilities we do. The Outer Banks is an amazing place to live. It is a very hard place to have a medical condition. And what was going on with me was just more than the doctors down there could handle. We came back, took a while, but I got in with, the right doctors and started heading it in the right direction. However, when you're treating postpartum depression, any kind of depression and anxiety, you put the long acting like the SSRIs and all those into play. But while you're waiting for them to kick in, you're dealing with the anxiety and the other issues, which you're treating with the fast acting, the benzos. I was unable to drink at this time just because I just was kind of a slug. But my disease was still growing and still progressive and still learning. And it learned that it liked the benzos. And where initially it started out, I would be having these very physical, extreme panic attacks, where I thought I was dying. And it was very physical. And, then you take the medication. Over a short period of time, it progressed to, I feel anxious. I'm going to take a Xanax. I don't like going here. I'm going to take a Xanax. I don't like this person. I'm going to take a Xanax. And in the process, I'm getting back to work. Things start coming back together, and I'm abusing the power I have as a pharmacist. I'm telling my doctors what I know they want to hear so that they'll write what I want them to write, and, filling my own prescriptions and all kinds of stuff. And, my disease has learned at this point, a pill is as good as you can get when you can't drink. And then when you can drink, a pill and a drink together are really the answer, except when I'm at work. I won't let myself use anything when I'm at work, because I realize that I would likely kill somebody. The chain I'm working for probably preferred that I didn't do that. So again, I'm back where I was when I was pregnant, and I had no coping skills. I couldn't handle life on life's terms. I couldn't handle customers. I couldn't handle anything. And I ended up going out on a medical leave again. And, we kind of went with the postpartum depression anxiety role because it already fit, and it could explain some of the changes in my behavior. while I was out on that leave, there was a situation that happened. And, I call it my perfect storm event, but I was destined to crash big. What happened was a friend of mine from high school had died unexpectedly, and they had the wake at a bar. We got there early in the morning. I took my husband with me. I was drinking all day. He didn't know these people. These were friends of mine from 20 years earlier. I was drunk and he left. I give him credit for hanging in there as long as he did. I ended up going home with a group of people I'd known in high school, and somebody put a line of cocaine in front of me. Now, in high school and college, I was very adamant about illegal drugs, to the point where I threatened to call the police on my roommates once in college for smoking dope. Because, don't you know who I am? Don't you know I'm going to be a pharmacist? And that night, my disease had progressed to the point where somebody put something down in front of me. Go big or go home, I did that half a line. And when I speak to the students, I tell them, don't ever let someone tell you you can't get hooked from that very first, because that very first is how your body knows it likes it. And in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I destroyed our life. Cocaine became my answer. I could drink the way I wanted to and not get sloppy. I could drink the way I wanted to and be up all night. I could drink the way I wanted to and not have any consequences per se. I spent all of our savings. My husband left. He took our son, who was 2 at the time. I found out exactly what lines I will cross to drink and use the way I want to. I found out, there's a phrase we use in 12-step programs, and it's pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. And when I got cleaned up and I got sober, I heard that phrase and I knew what that was, because that was how I woke up every morning during that time period. At the end of about 8 weeks, my husband came home and, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to split up. Here's this guy I met on the beach. We've got this dream life, and I said, I want to split up, take the baby and leave me the dog. And she was a very nice dog. She was a bulldog. She was great. But that's the kind of person I am when faced between the choice of drugs and alcohol and the world. The dog doesn't need anything. The baby does. I want nothing that's going to get in the way of me and that next drink, and a baby will. I will always, when it comes to drugs and alcohol, put whatever is most important to me second to the drink or the drug. What happened was I ended up overdosing that night, went into the hospital, and one of the first things they do is they run a tox screen. And I came to in the ICU with my PCP sitting there. And he had suspected something was going on. He had called me out once. I was very terribly offended. And I told him, I was going to switch PCPs. And I just had not gotten around to it. I woke up and he told me that the game was over, that he was turning me into the State Board of Pharmacy. I was going to lose my license. He knew what it was up. He knew what was going on. And all of a sudden, I went from this woman who said, take the baby, leave me the dog, to, don't you know, my husband gave up his career so we could come to Western Pennsylvania. And don't you know, I'm supporting our family, and all those things we say. And he said, I'm sorry, Richelle. He said, I have to. He said, I took an oath to do no harm. And if I let you loose, he said, if you don't kill yourself first, you will kill an innocent patient. And he said, and I cannot allow that to happen. And he left. And I was devastated. So I called my dad, because my dad was my fixer. My dad had always been my fixer. At one point, because he was a teacher and because we owned this large farm, at one point, most of the cops had either had him as a teacher when they were students or had worked for him on the farm. So, there were a lot of times I had potential to get in trouble, and I got out of it because of who my father was. So, I called my dad, and I'm crying, and my parents don't know what's going on, because we had this nice cover story of depression and anxiety and the postpartum. They just know that I'm in the hospital and that I've overdosed, but they don't really understand why. So, I'm crying. My dad's, Richelle, what's wrong? I'm like, we need the attorney. I need help. I'm in trouble. What's wrong? And I said, Daddy, I tested positive for cocaine. And he said, I'm sorry, Richelle. You got yourself into it. Get yourself out. And he hung up. And to this day, I can still feel it. And I looked up, and there was one of those exit signs like you see illuminating. And I remember staring at the exit sign. I could see it from my room and thinking, dear God, please help me. Because that was it, So I called my husband, second choice, and, told him what was going on. And to this day, I don't know if it was him or if it was my physician, and it really doesn't matter. But that night I got a phone call from a woman who was with the pharmacy peer existence program at the time that worked with the State Board of Pharmacy. And she told me if I did exactly what they told me to do, the way they told me to do it, and didn't try to do it Richelle's way or another way or anything other than what they did, that maybe someday I could be a pharmacist again. And that was it. That was a turning point. I did not think I had a problem. I did not think I was going to change. I signed a contract with the State Board of Pharmacy, and my plan was to do what they said I had to do, get myself out of trouble, and go back to living the way I was living because I didn't have a problem. And somewhere along the line, I started to hear what they had to say, and I started to learn a little bit about myself. I didn't have to go to inpatient rehab because they had detoxed me in the hospital. So I started, with intensive outpatient rehab, and I started to hear what they had to say. And I remember sitting in rehab and did this exercise, and I read my mind out loud, and the guy sitting next to me was there. He was rough. It was real rough. I'm sitting there in my khaki pants and white button down, and he turns to me and he's like, dude, you got a problem. And I was like, me? You're here as a condition of your parole. Like, how can you tell me I have a problem? But I heard him. A little bit got through. And, I went home and I said to my husband that evening, I think maybe they know what they're talking about. I think maybe I have a problem. And I got to give him credit. I'd have laughed at me. I would have blunt out laughed at me. And he just said, really? How about that? And just walked away. It wasn't a real happy time period in our house. And with that little shift came a little bit of a change. And then that next shift was a little bit of a change. And before too long, I found myself doing it, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I came to get sober and clean to get out of trouble because I'm a people pleaser. My parents were mad at me. My brothers were mad at me. I didn't have any friends left to be mad at me, but if I would have, they would have been mad at me too. My marriage was on the rocks. Everything was going wrong. And I'm a people pleaser. I don't want that. And, I started to change and do it because I wanted to, because things were starting to get better. Things were starting to come together. Things were working. And, right off the bat, though, I got hit with a situation that really made me see things a little bit differently as far as life and what was going on. I mentioned we have a son, and he was 2 turning 3 when I got sober, and he was different. I live on a farm still, and there's no other kids around, but we had him in daycare 1 day a week. My husband was a stay-at-home dad, but we put him in daycare to give my husband some time off. And the daycare director came up to my husband when he picked him up one day and said, I think you need to take Richard down to the University of Pittsburgh to Children's and have him evaluated. And he said, well, what's going on? She said, I really am not supposed to tell you what I think. She said, but we were friends from high school. And she said, I think he's on the autism spectrum. So on January 24th, 2007, we went down to Children's. They spent about 4 hours evaluating him, spent all this time with the little guy. And then they spend a much, much shorter time period in those days. I mean, that was like 20 years ago, telling you what he's not going to be and what his future looks like and what you have to do to give him any chance to have a future. And, that's hard. Your child's different, but until you hear it from someone else, it doesn't really compute. We had to get in the car then and drive 13 hours to my husband's grandfather's funeral in Florida. January of 2007, cell phones weren't what cell phones are now. You called people on them. Even texting was that old fashioned, where you do like 1, 2, 3, H, and 20 minutes later you say hi, So it was me and him and this little boy in the car. And we had to talk about it, and we had to work through it, and we had to figure it out, and we had to put it all together, and we couldn't yell at each other, and we couldn't blame, and we couldn't point fingers. We just had to look at the problem right there in front of us and get into the solution, not in the problem. And when we got to Florida, I knew then 3 things, and it was that our son was going to be okay, that my husband and I were going to be okay, and that I was going to be okay. I was only about 90 days sober, but it was the first time that I saw that things don't have to be the way they are.
Quite a challenge in very early recovery.
Yeah. And I learned right away talking about it and sharing it in the 12-step rooms, just like when I talk about my addiction and my alcoholism and how I drank and how I used and how I felt. Talking about the problems with my son and what we were facing and what we were up against, people would come up to me and they would share their stories about their children in the same place and how they got through it without drinking or using. And that gave me the hope that I could build on their story to make it my own way. Right away, it pulled me in. I shared where I was at and I shared when I needed help, and I learned to ask for help. My son and my story has really overlapped a lot. We both came into our journeys right at the same time. And, all these things they told us he wasn't going to be. He was never going to be able to go to college. He was never going to be able to be independent. He'd never have a friend group. He'd never be part of. He would always be excluded. He's a sophomore at Pace University in New York City, living in Lower Manhattan. He has roommates. He is thriving in a program without any labels on him.
Wow, that's amazing.
He is just Richard, this kid in stage management. And, just like today, I'm thriving in a world that I had no expectation of being in, every day today. And I realize this a little bit more. A lot of people that I used to party with have passed. And there was just another recent one of that group I ran with. And every day I have today is a blessing. It's a miracle. It's bonus time, because 18 years now, drinking and using and doing what I was doing, I would not be alive. There is 100% without a doubt. My days today are bonus. I'm that bonus round in the game show.
And is that how many years you have? 18?
Yes.
Wow.
September 5th, 2006, 18 years this past September.
That is amazing. Congratulations. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm noticing a couple of trends between episode 1 and episode 2. I mean, one thing I heard both of you say is that, when you had that pill, or, in your case, you were talking about the benzos, he'd been talking about some opioid pills, that it was your coping skill. It became your coping skill. And I think I'm hearing from both of you something that I hear from my patients, which is like, when I'm in an environment where I'm not comfortable, or when I'm not happy with myself, it fills all of those gaps you feel at the time. And again, it's that pursuit of pleasure that then will morph into the avoidance of pain as you try to go without it. You both also had a professional say to you, if you don't stop this now, you or someone that you're caring for will have a horrible outcome. This is not going to end well. And it's really hard to hear that at first. I also heard both of you say that asking for help is a strength. And I don't think enough people see that. And I think that I can speak for the medical community, and I assume that pharmaceutical training, it's the same. They kind of call it the hidden curriculum. It's that, we don't suffer. We don't need anything. If you're on surgery rotation, you will stand for however many hours. You don't need to go to the bathroom. You don't need a drink of water. We're tough. We can suck it up. And, to ask for help is seen as a weakness. And I think that it's time for that culture shift to say, and especially to our trainees in pharmacy and in medicine, asking for help is a strength. Reaching out for help is a strength. Only good things can come from saying, look, this is what I have, this is what's okay, and this is what's not okay. And can someone kind of help me get from where I am to where I need to be? So that's amazing. I've also noticed in my practice that people in recovery, and I'm seeing two great examples between yourself and Dr. Morgan's story, people in recovery tend to be the most grateful people I've ever met, because they know they've been to the depths of hell and they know what it could be like. And they know that every moment that they have right now is a blessing and every breath is a blessing. But they're also, number two, the most motivated people that I meet. I'll see you guys doing these things above and beyond your call of duty or your own job, because you really want to get the word out. You want to be on that mountaintop with a megaphone and say, hey, listen to me. I've been there. And no wonder, that there are people in the profession that are also in recovery that say to people in the earlier steps of recovery, this is how things will go if we don't turn this around, because they see the Titanic going towards that iceberg, so to speak.
Oh, yeah. And, we spend a lot of time in the healthcare professions learning that there is a cure for everything. We don't have to feel anything we don't want to feel, and there's a workaround. And, you put that in the wrong person per se's head, better living through chemistry. I spent 6 years in college learning about all these great cures. And for me, that's like poison knowledge. And then in practice, we see the patients writhing in agony and we give them a shot and they relax. On some level, beyond us, it connects. It's evidence-based, proof that we don't have to feel anything we don't want to feel. And like Dr. Morgan was saying, things were different then. And, there were some workarounds that we had, but I'm still the same person. I see a situation and I'm right away looking for the workaround. Well, if I were going to, how would I? I mean, all the technology double checks and all those things, there are still going to be people like us figuring out how to beat the system.
It makes you really good eyes for people in training or in the profession that are having a problem.
Oh, yeah. And, there was a situation at work where they wanted a urine test on the guy before they'd give him anything, and they gave him the urine test and it was clean. And I brought it to the doctor's attention. I said, he has a fentanyl patch on. Why isn't he testing positive for that?
Good point.
And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, he's using somebody else's urine and didn't hit anybody else involved. I'm like, well, first thought wrong.
Right. So as far as other people in the pharmacy profession, if they were having a problem or knew somebody having a problem, I heard you mention the pharmacy peer assistance program. Is that still a program that's active?
The program that I got sober through is no longer the State Board of Pharmacy approved program. It's moved in under the PHP that the physicians and the nurses use now. But there is a program, they will tell you when you need to go to rehab. They will tell you what you need to do. They will help you get going with the fear that if you don't do what we tell you to do, you're done. Your career is done. And, in the beginning, I had a business card of a pharmacist that I had met through the process. He tried to do it his way, and he was working as a realtor trying to get his license back. And I carried that with me in my wallet to remind me that when I try to do things Richelle's way, that's how they end up. They're not kidding when they say you're done.
Where I work, we have a group therapy as well. It's a place that does IOP and those sorts of things. And I've overheard the groups sometimes. And I heard somebody who had a lot of years recovery say to somebody that was younger than them, your biggest problem will be if you come in here thinking you're in charge, because we saw how we ended up when we were in charge. We're not here because we were living our best life our way. And I like how you talked about life on life's terms, because it's so true. The world brings a lot of curveballs, and we can't change life's curveballs, but we can learn, to optimize our swing. And I think that you had a lot of internal work to do. And I presume, and we can welcome back in Dr. Morgan into this conversation. Did you find that was very helpful?
Yes, I did therapy. My husband and I did marriage therapy. And then through the 12-step program, doing what's expected of me there is a form of group therapy.
Absolutely.
I'm not the person that I was then. I have some things that still pop out, but I'm not the person that I was. I've learned better coping skills. I've learned to be comfortable in my own skin. I've learned that, it's okay to not be okay.
I think so often people look outside of themselves for the answer or the fix. And to your point, we want a pill for every ill. We want that quick magic medicine. And oftentimes we do have to do the work that's inside. And there was a quote, I hope I don't ruin this, but Carl Jung, I think it was, said, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens." And I always found that to be a very profound statement with regard to recovery. Dr. Morgan, did you also get a therapist in your own kind of volition to help deal with those things?
Yeah, well, it started out with CPH required me, Committee for Physicians Health through New York required me to procure a therapist, but I've actually had a psychiatrist now for 5 years. I've seen him every 3 months for 5 years. It's been the best thing I've ever done. And he actually used to run InnerCare. InnerCare is a company that takes addiction and recovery center for professionals that I am affiliated with now for 5 years. And they work directly with CPH as well. So yeah, just like Richelle was saying, therapy has just opened up doors for me, allowing me to look at myself in ways I didn't realize that I can't always look at myself. See, we talk about the Johari window, and I love talking about that, like bringing things out of my blind. And he was really good at bringing things out of my blind, things that I couldn't see myself and that my family couldn't see. So yeah, it's been amazing to have a therapist to work with, to really take me out of myself and make me look at myself in a different way. Very positive.
Thank you both so much. This has been really eye-opening, and I think we probably could have 100 episodes on this because there's so many different pieces to look at. But I think the commonality that we're all deciding is A, it doesn't matter whatever you are, fill in the blank, how educated you are, how, good of an upbringing you had, if you have money, if you don't have money, if you're any color, if you're anything, addiction can and will find you. If the setup is right and you're human, which we all are, and we have that part of our brain that's susceptible to these chemicals that are working psychoactively, that can grab onto our survival area of our brain and really can rewire those pathways. So it's so important if you or someone that you know is struggling to please reach out for help, because asking for help is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. And really, I think both stories really highlight that recovery is possible and support is available. I'd like to thank both of you very much for participating and for sharing your really, really moving stories. I'm sure there's so many people out there that have similar stories that keep it private. So it really takes a special person to be able to get out of our own ego and say, look, this isn't about me making myself look good. This is about me helping other people. Is there anything either of you would like to say before we close this 2-episode series?
First off, thank you very much for including me. I openly share my story. I live very openly at work in recovery. I figure if me being honest about who I was, what I've done, and where I was makes one person change their mind about what an addict is, what an addict isn't, then I'm doing the right thing. You know, I clean up nice. You know, somebody sees me, they don't think addict. They don't think I was what I was. But if I say it and they say, oh, she doesn't look like one, thank you very much for including me in this.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I've had medical students come with me to my addiction medicine clinic. And at the end of a shift, I'll say, so what'd you think? Is that what you pictured, quote unquote addicts looking like? And they're all like, no. And I'm like, well, they look just like you. They look just like me. They look just like all of us, out there trying to live our best lives. Sometimes we just need a little help, and it's not too late to ask.
And I want to thank you as well, Dr. Zona. And I couldn't agree with Richelle more. The day that I was hired by the medical school, the dean called me into his office and he literally looked at me and said, Dr. Morgan, we're taking a chance on you. However, I want you to be as transparent about your story as you can with all the students. I said, that won't be a problem. And to this day, over the past 5 years, I shared my story almost a dozen times with the students. And I've made many impacts on many lives, from students telling me about their heroin stories to students telling me that they're going into addiction medicine because of me. And you know what? Everything Richelle said was absolutely true. If you can make the difference in one person's lives, then my story was worth it. It could be one student out of 1,000. It could be one student out of 1,000,000. But if I made a difference in their life, then everything I said was worth it. So thank you for letting me share as well.
Absolutely. And thank you both so much. And I'd just like to remind our listeners, if you or someone you know is struggling, that the Pennsylvania PHP is available at 1-866-747-2255. And the FSPHP, the federal, is available at FSPMP.org. I'd like to thank both of our guests, Dr. Richard Morgan and Richelle Lehman, for sharing their stories, and for all of you listening. Be sure to subscribe to the POMA Does podcast. And if you have feedback, email poma@poma.org. And if you'd like to follow more of my content, I am Addiction Talk Doc, TOKDOK, on TikTok, and send your kids for some substance use prevention education. We will see you next time. Stay healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of POMA Does. Be sure to subscribe to POMA Does wherever you listen to your podcasts, and tell your friends and colleagues to tune in. Learn more about osteopathic medicine and POMA on our webpage, www.poma.org, and join the conversation on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Or email us at poma@poma.org. We'd love to hear from you. Join us next time for another edition of POMA Does.